Come on, Adrian. You can't tell me you've never noticed. Laughter drifted through the half-open library door. Elena Holloway froze with her hand on the brass handle. Inside, Adrian Ashcroft leaned comfortably against the fireplace, while several of his closest friends teased him after the family banquet. One of them grinned. Elena looks at you like you're the only man in the world. Another laughed. When are you finally going to admit she's in love with you? Adrian rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed smile. Elena? He chuckled softly. She's family. The words made Elena's fingers tighten around the tray she was carrying. I've never looked at her any other way. One of the men raised an eyebrow. But you're not related. We grew up together, Adrian replied. That's all. Another friend smirked. If she confessed tomorrow? Adrian sighed, completely unaware someone stood just outside the door. I'd let her down gently. She'll get over it. Those 4 words quietly shattered something inside Elena. She stepped backward before anyone noticed her. The teacups rattled against the silver tray in her trembling hands. No one heard. No one saw. She walked away without making a sound. After her father's death, silence had become familiar. His laughter no longer echoed through the estate. His study remained locked. His favorite chair gathered dust beside the window. Within weeks, Elena's stepmother had assumed complete control of Holloway Manor. Lawyers arrived. Documents disappeared. Her inheritance quietly vanished into complicated legal accounts she was never allowed to see. The bedroom her father had decorated for her became a guest suite for wealthy visitors. She was moved into the attic. No arguments, no explanations, only quiet instructions that everyone expected her to obey. Through it all, Adrian had remained kind. He carried heavy boxes upstairs when she moved, brought her books from the library, remembered her birthday every year, asked whether she had eaten whenever the household forgot. Those small acts of kindness had slowly become something far more dangerous inside her heart. Love, the kind she had never intended to feel, the kind she had never been brave enough to confess. Now she understood. To him, she had never been anything more than the little girl who grew up beside him. Long after the house fell asleep, Elena sat beneath the tiny attic window. Moonlight spilled across the worn wooden floor. A single candle flickered beside a blank sheet of paper. She dipped her pen into ink, then began writing. Not to ask Adrian to choose her, not to change his mind, only to say goodbye. She thanked him for protecting her when they were children, for teaching her how to ride horses, for sneaking slices of birthday cake into the attic after her father's funeral, for reminding her, even briefly, what it felt like to belong somewhere. When she reached the final line, tears blurred the page. She wrote only one sentence. "Thank you for giving me the happiest memories I'll never be able to forget." She folded the letter carefully, sealed it with blue wax. Across the front, she wrote only one word: Ash, the childhood nickname she had called Adrian since they were both small enough to climb apple trees together. Before sunrise, Elena packed one small travel bag, her mother's knitted scarf, a faded photograph of her father, a worn recipe book, nothing else. She walked away from Holloway Manor without waking anyone. At the village crossroads, a traveling courier adjusted the heavy satchel hanging from his horse. "I need this delivered," Elena said softly. The courier smiled. "It'll reach him." She thanked him and turned toward the neighboring town, where a bakery had agreed to hire an extra pair of hands. She never saw the courier stop a mile down the road to reorganize his overflowing bag. She never noticed 2 sealed envelopes accidentally slipping into the wrong compartments. One addressed to a young man called Ash, the other, to His Majesty, King Ashran Noctis of Blackstone Castle. By sunset, the wrong letter was already traveling toward the most feared Lycan king on the continent. 3 weeks passed. Elena settled into a quiet routine in the little town of Willowbrook. The bakery opened before sunrise every morning, filling the narrow streets with the comforting scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. She quickly learned how the baker liked his dough kneaded, which elderly customers preferred softer rolls, which children always spent their last copper coin on sweet honey buns after school. The work was exhausting, but it was peaceful. No one knew she had once lived in a grand estate. No one called her a burden. For the first time in months, she felt invisible in the gentlest way possible. One rainy afternoon, as Elena arranged loaves in the bakery window, someone knocked on the door. She looked up. A royal messenger stood outside, beneath a black cloak embroidered with a silver wolf crest. The entire bakery fell silent. The baker hurried forward. "Your business, sir?" The messenger's eyes searched the room until they rested on Elena. "I carry a letter for Lady Elena Holloway." Confused, she stepped closer. "For me?" The messenger bowed respectfully. "It bears the personal seal of His Majesty's household." A murmur spread through the bakery. Elena accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The seal was dark blue wax, pressed with an unfamiliar crest. She had never seen it before. "Thank you," she whispered. The messenger bowed once more before quietly leaving. She waited until her work ended before opening the letter. Outside the bakery, rain tapped gently against the windows of the tiny room she rented above the shop. She lit a candle, carefully broke the seal, and unfolded the thick, cream-colored paper. The handwriting was elegant, steady, beautifully deliberate. "You wrote that you no longer believe anyone would notice if you disappeared. I noticed. You thanked someone for giving you beautiful memories. Permit a stranger to thank you for reminding him that kindness deserves to be remembered. No one who writes with such honesty should ever believe they are forgotten. If the world has become too heavy, write again. Someone will answer." Elena read the letter twice. Then a third time, a small puzzled smile appeared. "The courier corrected the mistake," she whispered to herself. "He must have delivered it after all." But something felt different. Adrian would never write like this. His letters had always been brief, playful. This one felt thoughtful, almost lonely. She turned the envelope over again. There was no family seal, no return address, only the signature, Ash. That night, Elena sat by the window with a blank sheet of paper before her. She hesitated for nearly an hour. Finally, she dipped her pen into ink. "Dear Ash, I believe a courier accidentally delivered my letter to the wrong person. It wasn't meant for you. I'm sorry for troubling a stranger. But thank you for answering anyway. Your kindness reached someone who needed it more than you know. I hope the person you intended to write receives your words one day. I wish you happiness." Elena, she smiled softly, folded the letter, sealed it. This time she carefully wrote the unfamiliar return address printed inside his envelope. Blackstone Castle. Surely whoever this mysterious Ash was, he would appreciate having the misunderstanding explained. 4 days later, the royal messenger returned. The baker looked up from kneading dough. "You again?" The messenger smiled. "I have another reply." Elena stared. "So soon?" He handed her another cream-colored envelope. The same elegant handwriting, the same dark blue seal. She blinked in disbelief. "I already explained the mistake." The messenger chuckled. "My lady?" He read your explanation. He replied anyway. As the messenger disappeared into the afternoon crowd, Elena looked down at the unopened letter in her hands. She had intended to end the misunderstanding. Instead, the stranger had chosen to continue the conversation. Elena stared at the unopened envelope for several minutes. Surely, this should have been the end of it. She had explained the courier's mistake. She had apologized for troubling a stranger. There was no reason for another letter to arrive. And yet, there it was. Resting quietly in her hands, she finally broke the seal. The handwriting was immediately familiar. "Dear Elena, I know the first letter was never meant for me, but I cannot pretend I regret reading it. Most people spend their lives trying to appear impressive. You accidentally chose honesty instead. That is much rarer. If you still wish our correspondence to end, I will respect your decision. But if you ever feel like telling a stranger how your bread turned out today, I would very much like to know. Elena laughed, a real laugh. The first one she had heard from herself in months. She folded the letter carefully. Perhaps one more reply wouldn't hurt. The letters became part of her life, almost without her noticing. Every 2 weeks, the royal messenger appeared outside the bakery. The townspeople eventually stopped asking questions. They simply smiled whenever they saw the familiar black horse waiting outside. Ash never asked where she lived, never asked her family name, never questioned why sadness sometimes slipped between her carefully chosen words. Instead, he asked simple things. What does fresh bread smell like before sunrise? Which season do you miss most? If you could keep only one childhood memory, which would you choose? Elena answered every question honestly. In return, she learned that Ash loved rainy evenings, collected old books, preferred quiet libraries to crowded celebrations, and believed that loneliness could exist even in rooms filled with people. Somehow, that confession made her feel less alone. Spring arrived, then summer. Months quietly became nearly a year. Elena's tiny room above the bakery slowly filled with carefully folded letters tied together using blue ribbon. Whenever work became difficult, she reread one. Whenever old memories returned, she wrote another. She never realized the letters were slowly healing the places heartbreak had left behind. Far away, inside Blackstone Castle, King Answere Noctis sat alone in his enormous library. A mountain of royal reports covered one side of his desk. Elena's newest letter rested on the other. His chancellor entered carrying trade agreements. Your Majesty, the Eastern delegates have arrived. Answere looked up absent-mindedly. Give me 5 minutes. The chancellor smiled knowingly. Another letter? Answere carefully folded the parchment. Yes. I've never seen anyone improve your mood quite so quickly. Answere glanced toward the rain falling beyond the tall windows. She reminds me that ordinary conversations are sometimes the most extraordinary. The chancellor hesitated. Does she know who you are? No. And you intend to keep it that way? For now. He smiled softly. I think she trusts the man writing the letters. I'd rather not confuse that by introducing the king. One autumn morning, Elena mailed another letter. It spoke about the bakery's newest apprentice, about the first snowfall gathering on nearby hills, about how she no longer cried every time she remembered Holloway Manor. She waited for a reply. 1 week passed, then 2, then a month. Nothing arrived. She told herself he was simply busy. Another month passed, still nothing. The familiar royal messenger stopped visiting. Winter settled over Willowbrook. For the first time in nearly a year, the small table beside her window stood empty. Elena never knew that far away, Blackstone Castle had fallen into mourning after an assassination attempt left the Lycan king gravely wounded. Answere never received her final letter, and she never received the invitation he had written with his own hand the day before the attack. 3 months later, as the first flowers of spring bloomed outside the bakery, a rider carrying the royal seal of Blackstone Castle finally appeared once again. This time, he wasn't delivering a letter. He carried an invitation. Elena turned the heavy cream-colored envelope over in her hands. The royal seal of Blackstone Castle shimmered in the afternoon sunlight. For several moments, she simply stared at it. The baker wiped flour from his hands and smiled. You should open it. I don't think it's meant for me. The elderly man chuckled. That's exactly what you said about the first letter. Elena couldn't help smiling. He had a point. Carefully, she broke the wax seal. Inside rested a beautifully written invitation. By command of His Majesty, King Answere Noctis, Blackstone Castle welcomes merchants, artisans, teachers, healers, and honored guests to celebrate the Lycan King's birthday. Lady Elena Holloway is personally invited to attend. At the bottom appeared one familiar signature. Ash, her heart skipped. For nearly a year, she had exchanged letters with someone she knew only by that name. Now, he wanted to meet. The journey to Blackstone Castle took 4 days. The farther north she traveled, the larger the mountains became. By sunset, on the 4th evening, the castle finally appeared. It rose from dark cliffs overlooking a silver lake, its black stone towers reaching toward the clouds. She had imagined something cold, intimidating. Instead, the castle gardens overflowed with white roses. Children laughed beside fountains. Musicians filled the courtyards with gentle melodies. It felt surprisingly alive. A steward welcomed her warmly. "Lady Elena, His Majesty has been expecting you." She blinked. "Expecting me?" For quite some time. That evening, hundreds of guests filled the grand ballroom. Scholars debated beside artists. Farmers spoke comfortably with nobles. No one seemed out of place. Elena admired the warmth of it all. A trumpet sounded. The master of ceremonies stepped forward. "Please welcome His Majesty, King Answere Noctis." The great doors opened. The room immediately fell silent. The Lycan King entered, wearing a dark formal coat embroidered with silver thread. He carried himself with quiet confidence rather than overwhelming authority. His silver-gray eyes slowly searched the crowd. Then, "They found her," he smiled. Not the practiced smile of a king greeting his subjects, the familiar smile she had imagined countless times while reading his letters. He descended the marble staircase without hesitation. Guests instinctively stepped aside. Stopping only a few feet away, he bowed his head slightly. "I was beginning to think," he said softly, "you'd never visit." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "It was you." Answere nodded. "It always was." She reached into her handbag and slowly removed one of his old letters. "I recognized the handwriting. So did I." For a moment, neither spoke. Then they both laughed. A simple mistake, a misplaced letter, had somehow brought them to this moment. Answere looked at her warmly. "I've wanted to thank the courier for months." Elena smiled. "I think I finally do too." Hundreds of miles away, back at Holloway Manor, Adrian searched for an old notebook inside the bottom drawer of his writing desk. Instead, his hand touched an unopened envelope sealed with faded blue wax. Across the front, one familiar childhood nickname was written in careful handwriting: Ash. Confused, he broke the seal. As he began reading, the color slowly disappeared from his face. The letter he should have received had been waiting for him all along. Adrian read the letter once, then again, then a third time. Each sentence felt heavier than the one before it. There were no accusations, no desperate pleas, no attempt to make him feel guilty. Only gratitude. "Thank you for making me laugh when Father died. Thank you for carrying my books when no one else noticed how heavy they were. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still existed. I hope your future is filled with people who love you the way you deserve. Goodbye, Ash." His hands trembled. Goodbye. She hadn't written hoping he would stop her. She had already decided to leave. He remembered that morning. He had assumed Elena was helping at the market. By the time anyone realized she was gone, she had vanished without a trace. Adrian slowly folded the letter. A crushing realization settled over him. She hadn't disappeared because she hated him. She disappeared because she believed there was no place left for her beside him. For the first time in years, Adrian walked into the attic. The tiny room remained almost exactly as Elena had left it. A faded blanket covered the narrow bed. A cracked teacup still rested on the windowsill. Near the corner stood the small wooden chair where she used to spend hours reading while rain tapped against the roof. He lowered himself into it. Only then did he notice faint scratches carved into the windowsill, tiny lines, one beneath another. He counted them. 312. The housekeeper quietly spoke from the doorway. She made one every evening after your father passed. Adrian looked up. What do they mean? Days. The elderly woman smiled sadly. She once told me she was counting how long it had been since someone asked if she was happy. His chest tightened. He had asked whether she had eaten, whether she needed books, whether she wanted company. He had never once asked if she was happy. The search began the following morning. Adrian traveled through neighboring villages, carrying Elena's old photograph. Most people had never seen her. Some remembered a quiet young woman buying flour. Others recalled a girl working briefly in an inn. Months passed. Every trail ended the same way. Too late. One rainy afternoon, an elderly merchant finally recognized the picture. I know her. Adrian's heart raced. Where? Blackstone. The Lycan kingdom. I saw her helping children during the Harvest Charity Festival. The festival filled the streets surrounding Blackstone Castle. Music drifted through colorful market stalls while volunteers distributed bread, blankets, and medicine. Adrian searched the crowd desperately. Then he saw her. Elena stood beneath a white canopy, laughing as she helped a little girl decorate fresh loaves of bread with honey. She looked different, not because she had changed, because she no longer carried sadness in her eyes. A tall man beside her accepted baskets from waiting volunteers before quietly handing them to elderly villagers. He wore no crown, no ceremonial robes, only simple dark clothing, yet every person greeted him with effortless respect. King Answere. He smiled whenever Elena spoke, listened whenever she offered an idea, never interrupted, never stepped in front of her. They worked together as though it had always been that way. Adrian understood immediately. Happiness looked natural on her. When the afternoon crowd finally thinned, Elena turned. Their eyes met. Surprise crossed her face. Adrian? He walked toward her slowly. I've been looking for you. She smiled gently. I know. You knew? The messenger told me someone had been asking about a baker named Elena in every town along the western road. He lowered his eyes. I found your letter. She nodded quietly. I thought you might. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Adrian took a slow breath. Would you? He looked at her with sincere regret. Walk with me for a little while? Elena glanced toward Answere. The Lycan king simply smiled and gave a small nod before returning to help unload another wagon. She turned back to Adrian. All right. As they walked away from the festival together, both knew the conversation should have happened years earlier. The festival slowly faded behind them. Children's laughter became distant as Elena and Adrian followed a quiet path beside the castle gardens. Wild flowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Adrian finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. 2 simple words. Years too late. Elena looked at the flower beds instead of him. I know, he blinked. You do? She smiled faintly. I could see it on your face the moment you found me. He lowered his head. I read your letter. Every word. I don't know how many times. His voice trembled. I kept wishing you'd been angry. Why? Because anger would have been easier to forgive. She looked at him gently. There wasn't any anger. Only sadness. Adrian stopped walking. I was an idiot. I thought being kind was enough. I never realized kindness could also become hope. Elena nodded slowly. It wasn't your fault that I fell in love. I never blamed you for that. He looked at her with tear-filled eyes. But I broke your heart. You broke the dream I created. She answered softly. Those aren't always the same thing. The words settled heavily between them. Adrian realized she was right. He had never promised her forever. She had simply imagined one. Yet that didn't erase the careless way he had spoken about her. I should never have laughed, he whispered. I should have protected your feelings, even if I didn't return them. Elena smiled. Thank you for saying that. They reached a quiet stone bench overlooking the castle lake. Adrian looked toward the distant towers. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you love him? Elena followed his gaze. Answere stood across the gardens, helping servants arrange tables for the evening feast. Despite being king, he carried chairs alongside everyone else. No one seemed surprised. She laughed softly. No. Adrian frowned in confusion. No? She smiled. Not at first. I trusted him. She folded her hands in her lap. He never asked me to become someone else. He never treated me like a burden. He never assumed my feelings. He simply listened. She looked back at Adrian, and somewhere along the way, trust quietly became love. Adrian watched Answere greet an elderly gardener with the same warmth he offered noble guests. The king noticed Elena in the distance. He smiled, raised one hand in greeting, then returned to his conversation without interrupting theirs. Adrian understood immediately. Answere wasn't watching to control the conversation. He was simply letting Elena know he was nearby if she needed him. Nothing more. I used to think love was grand gestures, Adrian admitted. Now I think... He smiled sadly. It's making someone feel safe enough to be themselves. Elena nodded. I think so too. He stood. I won't ask you to come home. There isn't a home for me there anymore, she answered gently. I know. He took one slow breath. I only wanted you to know. I truly am sorry. She stepped forward and embraced him. Not as the girl who had once loved him in silence, as someone who had finally found peace. When they pulled apart, Adrian smiled through misty eyes. I hope you're happy. I am. I can see that. He glanced toward Answere once more. He never pretended to be perfect. Elena smiled warmly. No. He simply never pretended to be anyone except himself. As Adrian walked away, he realized he hadn't truly lost Elena to another man. He had lost her to the quiet honesty of someone who answered a stranger's broken heart without expecting anything in return. The following spring, invitations bearing the royal seal of Blackstone Castle began arriving in every neighboring kingdom. King Answere was announcing a new project, one inspired by a single misplaced letter that had changed 2 lonely lives forever. 1 year later, the courtyard of Blackstone Castle overflowed with visitors. Kings and merchants stood beside farmers. Teachers chatted with soldiers. Children ran between rows of white flower boxes, while musicians filled the spring air with gentle melodies. No one had gathered for a royal wedding or a military victory. They had come to witness the opening of something far simpler, a building made entirely for hope. Above its oak doors hung a hand-carved wooden sign, the House of Letters. Beneath it was another inscription. Every letter deserves an answer. Answere stood before the assembled crowd. He wore no royal cape, only a simple charcoal coat with the silver crest of Blackstone stitched over his heart. Beside him stood Elena, dressed just as simply. She had insisted the day belonged to the people who would one day walk through those doors, not to a king and queen. Answere smiled as he looked across the sea of expectant faces. I should begin with a confession. The crowd laughed softly. I once opened someone else's mail. The laughter grew louder. Several nobles exchanged amused glances. Answere reached into his coat and carefully removed a worn envelope sealed with faded blue wax. I wasn't supposed to receive this. He held it up for everyone to see. A traveling courier accidentally switched 2 letters. I could have returned it unopened. I almost did. He looked toward Elena. I'm very grateful I didn't. The courtyard became completely quiet. Answere continued. The woman who wrote this letter believed she was saying goodbye. She never expected anyone to answer, but I couldn't ignore words written with such honesty. He smiled gently. So I wrote back. Elena looked down, laughing softly through misty eyes. I spent weeks trying to explain the mistake. The crowd chuckled. He refused to stop writing. Ashrin shrugged with exaggerated innocence. I thought she told wonderful stories about bread. Even the palace guards laughed. Ashrin gestured toward the newly opened building. Loneliness is quieter than hunger. Most people never see it. They walk past it every day. He looked around the crowd. Inside this house, no letter will ever be ignored. If someone writes because they're grieving, they will receive compassion. If someone writes because they're afraid, they will receive courage. If someone writes because they believe no one notices them, they will receive proof that someone does. Volunteers standing inside the entrance applauded. Many had traveled from distant kingdoms after hearing the story of the mistaken letter. Teachers, widows, retired soldiers, young students, all had offered to answer letters from strangers. Ashrin turned toward Elena. His expression softened. One more thing. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A surprised murmur spread through the courtyard. Instead of opening a velvet ring box, he unfolded the very first letter she had written years ago beneath the attic window. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but every word remained carefully preserved. He smiled. The greatest mistake of my life, he lifted the letter, was opening someone else's mail. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. It became the greatest blessing of mine. He reached into his pocket and finally revealed a simple silver ring. I answered your words once. His voice became quieter. May I spend the rest of my life answering your heart? Tears slipped down Elena's cheeks. She remembered the lonely girl who had believed no one would notice if she disappeared. She barely recognized her now. Laughing through happy tears, she nodded. I was hoping you would. Ashrin placed the ring on her finger. The entire courtyard erupted into applause. Children cheered. Musicians began playing joyful melodies. Even strangers wiped away tears. Not because destiny had arranged everything perfectly, but because one ordinary mistake, a misplaced letter, and one thoughtful reply, had quietly changed 2 lives forever. The first letter arrived before sunrise. It rested alone inside the polished wooden mailbox outside the House of Letters. Elena unlocked the front door and smiled. We're open. Ashrin picked up the envelope carefully. No return address. She nodded. Just as we promised. They carried it inside together. The letter belonged to an elderly widow who had lost her husband 6 months earlier. She confessed she had forgotten what it felt like to hear someone say her name. She wasn't asking for money or advice. She simply wanted someone to write back. Ashrin quietly folded the page. We'll answer today. Within weeks, 1 letter became 10. 10 became 100. Soon, messengers arrived from every neighboring kingdom, carrying sacks filled with carefully sealed envelopes. Some were written in neat handwriting. Others were little more than shaky pencil marks. One came from a young soldier terrified before his first battle. Another from a little girl who missed the mother she barely remembered. A lonely shepherd wrote that his sheep listened better than people. A village teacher admitted she was exhausted from pretending to be strong every day. Every letter received the same promise. Someone would answer. No one would be forgotten. The house quickly grew beyond anything Elena had imagined. Teachers volunteered to mentor frightened children through letters. Retired healers comforted grieving families. Former soldiers wrote to wounded veterans struggling to begin again. Even prisoners who sincerely wished to change received thoughtful replies instead of silence. The house never judged, it simply listened. Elena personally trained every volunteer. The words matter, she reminded them often. But how we make people feel matters even more. She taught them never to rush a reply, never to offer empty promises, and never to underestimate the courage it took for someone to ask for kindness. Ashrin remained the busiest volunteer of them all. Despite ruling an entire kingdom, he insisted on answering letters every evening after council meetings. One young advisor finally asked, "Your Majesty, surely someone else could do this." Ashran smiled without looking up from the page he was writing. "Perhaps. But somewhere, someone is waiting to know whether their voice matters." He dipped his pen into ink again. "I know what that wait feels like." The advisor never asked again. Years passed. The House of Letters expanded into every province of the Lycan kingdom. Soon neighboring kingdoms requested permission to establish their own chapters. No one paid for a reply. No one was ever turned away. The project became known as the kingdom's greatest gift to the continent, not because it ended wars, because it quietly healed hearts before despair could become hopelessness. One spring morning, a group of school children visited the original House of Letters. They watched volunteers carefully reading fresh bundles of mail while others wrote thoughtful replies beside sunny windows. One little boy tugged gently on Elena's sleeve. "Your Majesty." She knelt so they were eye level. "Yes? Is it true? This whole place exists because of one wrong letter?" She laughed softly. "It is." The children looked at one another in amazement. Another little girl frowned. Then, "Do you regret writing it?" Elena looked across the room. Ashran sat near the fireplace, smiling as he carefully answered another anonymous letter. She smiled back before turning to the children. "Tomorrow," she said gently, "I'll tell you the whole story." Outside, another courier arrived carrying a fresh bundle of letters from distant kingdoms. Inside, not a single envelope would be left unopened. Not a single heart would be left unanswered. The following morning, the House of Letters opened its doors before sunrise. Golden light spilled through tall windows, warming the long wooden tables where volunteers sorted fresh bundles of mail. The group of school children returned exactly as they had promised. They gathered around Elena with eager smiles. "You said you'd tell us the story," one little girl reminded her. Elena laughed softly. "I did." She glanced toward Ashran. He was seated by the front window, already reading another anonymous letter with the same quiet concentration he had shown for years. Some things, she thought, should never change. "When I was about your age," Elena began, "I believed the people we love always know how we feel." The children listened closely. "I learned that isn't always true." She told them about losing her father, about moving into the attic after her stepmother took over the estate, about the loneliness that slowly settled into her heart. She even spoke of Adrian, not with bitterness, only gratitude. "He was kind to me. He simply didn't love me the way I loved him." A boy frowned. "Weren't you angry?" She shook her head. "I was heartbroken. Those are different things." The children grew thoughtful. Heartbreak eventually heals, but bitterness keeps the wound open. She reached into a small wooden box and carefully removed an old envelope. The blue wax seal had faded with time. "This is the first letter I ever wrote. It wasn't written for the king." The children giggled. "It was written to say goodbye." She smiled. "I thought no one would ever read it." Ashran looked up from his desk. "I certainly wasn't supposed to." Laughter filled the room. He walked over, carrying another envelope. "The courier made a mistake. The best mistake of my life." He gently slipped his hand into Elena's. "If I had returned that letter unopened, I would have missed meeting the bravest woman I've ever known." Elena smiled warmly. "And I would have missed the man who taught me that sometimes being heard is the beginning of healing." Later that afternoon, another familiar visitor arrived. Adrian. The children looked curiously toward him. He smiled and carried a stack of freshly written replies. "I volunteer on Thursdays." One little girl blinked. "You answer letters too?" "I do." He nodded. "I once learned what happens when kind words are left unsaid. So now, I try not to waste the chance." Elena smiled at him across the room. Over the years, Adrian had married, raised a family, and quietly supported the House of Letters in every way he could. The past no longer stood between them. It had become a lesson they both carried with grace. As evening settled over Blackstone Castle, the final courier of the day emptied one last basket onto the sorting table. Ashrin picked up the first envelope. Elena reached for the second. Around them, volunteers did the same. Hundreds of letters, hundreds of stories, hundreds of people hoping someone, somewhere, would answer. Above the entrance to the House of Letters hung the inscription Elena had chosen years before. The right person may not be the one you wrote to, but sometimes they are the one who chooses to answer. Visitors often paused to read those words before walking inside. Many entered carrying sorrow. Most left carrying hope, because long ago, a young woman believed she was writing the final page of her story. Instead, she accidentally mailed the first chapter of a life she had never imagined. A king answered a letter that was never meant for him. A lonely heart discovered it had always been worthy of being heard. And from that day forward, no letter that entered the House of Letters was ever left unanswered. Because a king and a queen understood one truth better than anyone else. Sometimes, a single reply can change the course of an entire life.